This is New Zealand, a country that most people imagine as endless mountains, sheep-covered hills, and stunning movie backdrops. And while all of that is true, there's a fact about New Zealand that doesn't usually make it into the postcards or travel ads. Nearly 80% of this country's land area is completely empty of people. Vast stretches of mountains, plains, forests, and coastline remain untouched by permanent human settlement. That number is especially surprising once you realize that New Zealand isn't some tiny dot on the map. It's actually much larger than most people think. The North and South Islands together are bigger in size than the entire United Kingdom. And when placed across the United States, they would stretch from Florida all the way up into Pennsylvania. On paper, this is a country with more than enough space for tens of millions of people. And it's not just about size. New Zealand also has one of the world's most comfortable climates to live in. Its weather patterns are strikingly similar to Western Europe, with mild summers, cool but not freezing winters, and plenty of rainfall. The climate is so temperate that the same category is used to describe both New Zealand and places like Ireland, France, and the UK regions that today hold some of the highest population densities on Earth. In other words, if you were to look only at the geography and climate, you might expect New Zealand to be crowded with cities. But instead, the country's population barely surpasses 5 million, and most of them are crammed into a handful of cities on the North Island, leaving everything else wide open and nearly untouched. So why does a country with a big landmass, a favorable climate, and modern infrastructure still feel so empty? Why does New Zealand, with all the same apparent advantages as other islands like Britain or Honshu in Japan, have only a fraction of the people? To understand this puzzle, you have to peel back the layers of the story, starting with the land itself, then tracing the history of who arrived here when they came, and how they tried to build a life in one of the most isolated corners of the earth. Asterisk, at first glance, New Zealand's land seems like it should be perfect for people. The two main islands, the North Island and the South Island, aren't among the largest islands in the world. Together, they cover more ground than Great Britain. And if you were to place them across the eastern United States, they would sprawl from the warm subtropics of Florida all the way up into the cooler forests of Pennsylvania. That much space, paired with a climate classified as oceanic and temperate, sounds like the recipe for dense populations and thriving cities. This same climate supports some of the busiest regions of Europe, from France to Germany, as well as parts of North America and even South America. In fact, almost everywhere else on the planet with a climate like this is filled with millions upon millions of people. But New Zealand is the outlier. Despite being as large as many other heavily settled islands, its overall population density is among the lowest in the developed world. For comparison, the United Kingdom holds nearly 69 million people packed into its smaller landmass, while New Zealand houses just over 5 million. That means the UK is roughly 15 times denser than New Zealand. To put it another way, more people live on the Japanese island of Honshu or the Indonesian island of Java, both smaller than New Zealand than in the entire country. These comparisons drive home just how unusual New Zealand's empty spaces really are. And even within the country itself, the population is distributed in ways that look uneven at best. Roughly 3/4 of all New Zealanders live on the smaller North Island, leaving the much larger South Island sparsely inhabited. Then, within the North Island, nearly half the population lives around a single city. So even though the climate and size might suggest that New Zealand could be comfortably populated across its land, the reality is that most of it has been left empty, with people clustering in a few urban centers instead of spreading out. So the big question is, what explains this imbalance? Why does such a large and livable country have so few people spread so unevenly across its territory? To understand that, we have to look at where New Zealand is located on the map, and how its sheer isolation from the rest of the world shaped its history. The first and most obvious reason behind New Zealand's emptiness is its position on the map. If you were to divide the world into a land hemisphere and a water hemisphere, New Zealand would sit right in the middle of the watery side. In almost every direction around it, there is nothing but open ocean for thousands of kilometers. Its closest neighbor is Australia, and even that is nearly 2,000 kilometers away across the Tasman Sea. Beyond that lies only scattered Pacific islands, Antarctica to the south, and then empty water stretching until you eventually hit South America or Asia, even in the modern age of aircraft and shipping. The South Pacific remains one of the quietest regions on the globe in terms of human activity. It still takes about 4 hours just to fly from Auckland to Sydney, which is roughly the same as flying across the entire continent of Europe from London to Athens. This extreme isolation meant that New Zealand was the last major habitable landmass on Earth to be discovered and settled by humans. For most of history, while civilizations were rising and falling across Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, New Zealand remained untouched, an empty ecosystem cut off from the outside world. It wasn't until the 13th century that a group of Polynesian explorers, after navigating vast distances across the Pacific Ocean, stumbled upon these islands. At the same time that Mongol horsemen were carving out empires across Eurasia, New Zealand's human population stood at zero and only began to grow once the Maori arrived for centuries afterward. The Maori lived here in relative isolation, developing a distinct culture and society. No other humans knew the islands existed until the mid-1600s, when a Dutch sailor sighted them, and even then, sustained contact didn't begin until Captain James Cook's voyage in 1769. Compare that to islands like Great Britain or Japan, which had been settled for tens of thousands of years and already supported millions of people by the Middle Ages. New Zealand, by contrast, had less than 250,000 people by the time Europeans began to settle here. Starting so late in history meant that New Zealand's population base was always going to be smaller than other islands. While Britain or Java had centuries to grow and urbanize, New Zealand's timeline was compressed into just a few hundred years. This late arrival explains part of why New Zealand feels so empty today, but it isn't the whole story. Once Europeans began to arrive in large numbers during the 19th century, settlement patterns developed in unusual ways, and those decisions still shape where New Zealanders live now. When Europeans began to settle in New Zealand during the 19th century, they found a land already inhabited by the Maori, but still largely empty compared to the scale of the islands themselves. Early estimates suggest that after centuries of living here, the Maori population had grown to only around 200,000 people. But colonization brought with it devastating diseases to which the Maori had no immunity, violent conflict over land, and the sudden imposition of foreign laws and systems. Within little more than a century after sustained European contact, the Maori population had collapsed to fewer than 40,000, even as waves of new settlers arrived from Britain and Ireland. By the late 1800s, European colonists had become the overwhelming majority, numbering 500,000 across the islands. Interestingly, the first major waves of European settlement focused not on the more fertile North Island, but on the South Island. There were two reasons for this. The North Island was still home to a larger Maori population, and so many of the conflicts and wars of the colonial period unfolded there. At the same time, the discovery of gold in the South Island during the mid-19th century triggered a rush of migration and settlement. Mining towns sprouted quickly, and for a time the South Island actually held more people than the North. Christchurch grew on the flat Canterbury Plains, and Dunedin became one of the largest cities in the country. But this balance would not last. As the goldfields were exhausted and conflicts on the North Island subsided, population growth gradually shifted northward. The North Island offered warmer temperatures, better soils, and more accessible land for farming and settlement. By the 20th century, the North had firmly overtaken the South in population, and that gap has only widened ever since. Today, more than 3/4 of New Zealanders live on the North Island, while the South, despite being geographically larger, remains sparsely populated. This uneven development didn't happen by chance. It was shaped by the physical geography of the islands themselves, which offered more opportunity in some places and harsher limits in others. And nowhere are those limits more obvious than on the South Island, where mountains, rain, and soil have all conspired to keep most of the land empty. The South Island might look like a paradise on the surface, with dramatic peaks, sweeping valleys, and long stretches of coastline. But in reality, it's one of the most difficult places in the developed world to build large, sustainable settlements. The biggest challenge comes from the mountains. Running almost the entire length of the island are the Southern Alps, a massive range formed by the collision of the Pacific and Australian tectonic plates. Over millions of years, that collision has forced rocks upward to create a wall of peaks, rivaling Europe's Alps. 18 of these mountains rise above 3,000 meters, and the tallest, Ioraki/Mount Cook, stands nearly as high as Mount Fuji in Japan. These mountains dominate the landscape, taking up huge amounts of land that can't easily be farmed, built upon, or even crossed without significant effort. But the mountains don't just block space, they also shape the weather. Moist air blowing in from the Tasman Sea crashes into the western slopes of the southern Alps, producing some of the heaviest rainfall in the world. The narrow strip of land along the west coast is drenched with constant downpours, making farming or settlement there difficult. Once the air crosses the mountains, however, it loses its moisture and descends as hot, dry winds. This creates a powerful rain shadow on the eastern side, where flat plains exist but receive far too little rainfall to reliably grow crops. The result is a stark divide. One side of the island is rugged and soaked, the other is flat but prone to drought. Neither is especially suited for large-scale human settlement. Meanwhile, soils across much of New Zealand add another obstacle. Less than 2% of the country's land is considered truly arable and par. With desert nations like Jordan or Somalia, the soils of the North Island are somewhat better thanks to occasional volcanic eruptions that deposit minerals. But the South Island has no such advantage. Its soils are often thin, stony, and not well suited for crops. Taken together, the mountains, rainfall patterns, and poor soils make much of the South Island more picturesque than practical. So while the climate across New Zealand feels comfortable to live in, the land itself places hard limits on what can actually be done with it. And because the land has been difficult to tame, New Zealand's economy and society have been shaped in very different ways from other islands of similar size. Because so little of New Zealand's land can be used for crops, the country's economy developed along a very different path than most other islands of similar size. Instead of fields of wheat or rice, New Zealand turned its grasslands into pastures and filled them with animals. Sheep and cattle became the backbone of the economy, and the stereotype of there being more sheep than people in New Zealand is entirely accurate today. There are around 27 million sheep on the islands, more than 5 for every person, and roughly 10 million cattle as well. With such numbers, it's no surprise that New Zealand became the world's leading exporter of sheep products like wool and mutton, while dairy products from its cattle now make up its single largest export. This reliance on livestock wasn't simply a matter of preference. It was a geographic necessity. With only 2% of the land classed as arable, large-scale crop farming was never going to be sustainable. Grass, however, grows well even in areas where the soil is poor, and the temperate climate ensures animals can graze outdoors for most of the year. In a sense, New Zealand became the world's offshore ranch, raising animals and sending meat, dairy, and wool abroad in exchange for manufactured goods, oil, and other resources it could not easily produce itself. By 2019, these exports earned the country over 46 billion New Zealand dollars, feeding markets across more than 100 countries and producing enough food to sustain 40 million people 8 times the country's actual population. But this kind of specialization came with trade-offs. Unlike Britain or Japan, New Zealand could not support the dense populations or industrial development that come with large-scale agriculture and proximity to major markets. Its remote location meant high shipping costs, and its limited domestic population meant a small consumer base. Without competitive manufacturing or extractive industries like oil and gas, New Zealand's economy remained tied to its fields and herds, and that in turn capped the number of people who could be supported here. So while New Zealand is rich in natural beauty and agricultural exports, its geography ensured that it would never develop into a heavily industrialized nation with crowded cities across its landscape. Instead, the population concentrated in just a few regions, leaving most of the country quiet green and empty. While much of New Zealand's land looks beautiful and green, the truth is that very little of it can be used for farming crops. Less than 2% of the entire country is arable, which is a percentage similar to desert nations like Jordan or Somalia. But unlike those places, New Zealand doesn't face blistering heat or a lack of water. Instead, its problem comes from rugged terrain, poor soils, and uneven rainfall. That combination forced New Zealand to adapt in a very different direction. Rather than building an economy on wheat, rice, or corn, the country transformed into one giant ranch. Grasses thrive where crops fail, and that made New Zealand perfect for grazing animals. So sheep and cattle became the foundation of the economy. Today, the old joke about there being more sheep than people in New Zealand is absolutely true. The country has nearly 27 million sheep compared to just over 5 million people, and sheep products like wool and mutton turned New Zealand into the world's #1 exporter. But sheep aren't even the biggest story anymore. There are also more than twice as many cows as humans, and the dairy industry now dominates the nation's exports. Milk powder, butter, and cheese have replaced gold as the real wealth of New Zealand. By focusing on livestock, the country discovered its unique niche, an isolated offshore ranch supplying food to the rest of the world. In fact, New Zealand produces enough food to feed 40 million people every year, 8 times its own population. But because 95% of that food gets exported, most of the land remains locked up in pastures instead of opening to new towns or cities. Geography left New Zealand little choice, and economics made the pattern permanent. Instead of factories or vast fields of crops, its wide, empty spaces became grasslands filled with animals. And that reality still defines why so much of the country feels empty today. Asterisk, while much of New Zealand's land looks beautiful and green, the truth is that very little of it can be used for farming crops. Less than 2% of the entire country is arable, which is a percentage similar to desert nations like Jordan or Somalia. But unlike those places, New Zealand doesn't face blistering heat or a lack of water. Instead, its problem comes from rugged terrain, poor soils, and uneven rainfall. That combination forced New Zealand to adapt in a very different direction. Rather than building an economy on wheat, rice, or corn, the country transformed into one giant ranch. Grasses thrive where crops fail, and that made New Zealand perfect for grazing animals. So sheep and cattle became the foundation of the economy. Today, the old joke about there being more sheep than people in New Zealand is absolutely true. The country has nearly 27 million sheep compared to just over 5 million people, and sheep products like wool and mutton turned New Zealand into the world's #1 exporter. But sheep aren't even the biggest story anymore. There are also more than twice as many cows as humans, and the dairy industry now dominates the nation's exports. Milk powder, butter, and cheese have replaced gold as the real wealth of New Zealand. By focusing on livestock, the country discovered its unique niche, an isolated offshore ranch supplying food to the rest of the world. In fact, New Zealand produces enough food to feed 40 million people every year, 8 times its own population. But because 95% of that food gets exported, most of the land remains locked up in pastures instead of opening to new towns or cities. Geography left New Zealand little choice, and economics made the pattern permanent. Instead of factories or vast fields of crops, its wide, empty spaces became grasslands filled with animals. And that reality still defines why so much of the country feels empty today. Asterisk. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, the emptiness of New Zealand makes sense. The country has the size and climate of some of the world's most crowded islands, but its late discovery, limited soils, and rugged geography all combined to keep its population small. History, colonization, and economics then reinforced that pattern. Instead of dense cities and vast fields of crops, the land was turned into pastures for animals, locking much of it away from settlement. And even as immigration drives growth today, that growth is funneled into one city, making New Zealand both highly centralized and struggling with housing pressure. In the end, the empty spaces are not wasted. They are the foundation of the economy, producing food for tens of millions of people abroad. But it does raise the question, will this pattern last forever? New Zealand has always been shaped by forces outside its control, from isolation to geology to global demand for exports. In the future, new pressures, climate change, rising seas, and population growth could test whether the land stays as empty as it is today. For now, though, the mystery of New Zealand's wide open spaces isn't really a mystery at all. It's the product of history, nature, and economics, working together to create one of the most sparsely populated yet most productive countries on Earth.